You should be grateful I'm giving you a job so you can feel useful. You're old. Sitting at home all day gets boring. And remember, tonight you're just temporary staff. Don't go near the main guest tables. Don't try to talk to anyone. Just serve plates and clear them. It's not complicated. Brandon said that while adjusting his burgundy silk tie in front of the mirror in the dressing room at the Petroleum Club Houston, an exclusive club on the 35th floor of Meridian Tower, where the entire 5th anniversary celebration of Meridian Energy Solutions would take place that evening. He didn't look me in the eye. He didn't pause to see how I would respond. I stood in the black uniform of a server, a black mandarin collar shirt, black dress pants, a white apron tied at the waist, and looked at the mirror behind Brandon. The man in the reflection was me. 65 years old, hair completely gray, hands calloused from 37 years in the Texas oil industry, now dressed as a waiter. Wonderful, I said. Brandon turned to look at me for a second, unsure what that short answer meant. Then he nodded and walked out. My name is Arthur James Mitchell. I am 65 years old. For 37 years as a petroleum engineer, from June 1985, when I took my first job at ExxonMobil in the Permian Basin, to my retirement in 2022. I worked in 17 countries, designed 3 patented offshore extraction systems, and trained more than 400 young engineers. And on Friday night, April 14th, 2023, and I stood in the dressing room of the Petroleum Club Houston wearing a server's uniform for my son's company party. So this is how he repays me? The Petroleum Club Houston overlooks downtown from a height of about 300 meters. From the ballroom's glass windows, you can see the entire Houston skyline. The glass towers of the energy corridor, the flat suburbs stretching to the Texas horizon, and at night, the distant flicker of oil field lights along the Gulf Coast. I knew this building. I had been here many times in my career, not in a server's uniform, but in a suit and tie, sitting at these tables discussing contracts large enough to shift the energy balance of entire regions. About 60 guests attended the dinner that night. Meridian Energy Solutions business partners, several potential investors, and most importantly, a delegation from Vanguard Gulf Partners, the firm Brandon was negotiating with on a $4 million strategic consulting contract over 2 years. Brandon Mitchell, my son, 38 years old, CEO of Meridian Energy Solutions, stood at the center of the room with the smile of a man enjoying the moment he had been waiting for. He wore a navy Hugo Boss suit, hair neatly styled, polished leather shoes, and was shaking hands with an Asian man in his 50s, whom I recognized immediately. Michael Chen, executive representative of Vanguard Gulf Partners. The man I had coffee with 20 years ago at a small cafe in Katy, Texas, when we were mapping out the plan to build Vanguard. But I was carrying a serving tray, handing out canapes. No one in that room, including Michael Chen, recognized me in the black uniform. And that, as it turned out, was my greatest advantage that night. I need to tell you about those 37 years, because the story of that Friday night cannot be fully understood without them. I graduated in chemical engineering from Texas A&M in 1985, a valuable degree in Texas during the oil boom of the 80s. My father was a welder in Beaumont, my mother a cashier at Winn-Dixie. No one in my family had gone to college before me. I attended on a partial scholarship and worked 2 jobs for 4 years to pay the rest. ExxonMobil was still Exxon then. My first job was as a field engineer in Midland, Texas, living in a trailer near the field, working 12-hour days in Permian Basin heat that could reach 45 degrees Celsius in summer. No glamour, no prestige, just work. But I learned something there that no university could teach. Technical knowledge isn't something you read. It comes from standing beside a drilling rig at 3 in the morning and listening to the machinery to know when something is wrong, from smelling the air to detect a leak before sensors trigger, from reading the color of drilling mud to understand the geology. Over the next 20 years, I advanced, not quickly through connections, but steadily through trust. Project engineer, then technical lead, then regional manager. Each step came because a project was delivered on time, on budget, without accidents. In 2003, I left ExxonMobil after 20 years to help found Vanguard Gulf Partners, a strategic consulting firm focused on oil and gas investment and development in the Gulf of Mexico and Texas. I was one of 5 founding shareholders, contributing $200,000 initially, and more importantly, a 30-year network in the industry. I chose not to publicly attach my name to Vanguard because I was still consulting on certain ExxonMobil projects and wanted to avoid conflicts of interest. I was a silent partner, with full rights and responsibilities under the company charter, but absent from public documents. Over the next 20 years, Vanguard Gulf Partners became one of the most respected consulting firms on the Gulf Coast. Michael Chen, my colleague from offshore platform projects, became the public face of Vanguard. I was the one behind its most critical strategic decisions. Brandon James Mitchell grew up in a house in Memorial, a West Houston neighborhood often called oil country suburb, because many residents worked in the energy sector. He grew up comfortable not because I was wealthy, but because I worked hard and saved carefully. Brandon studied business at the University of Texas, graduating in 2008, and worked at several smaller energy firms before starting Meridian Energy Solutions in 2018. I didn't discourage it. In fact, I supported it. Entrepreneurship is something I respect. In its first year, Meridian did well. The oil market was favorable, and Brandon had a natural talent for business networking, in a way I freely admit surpassed mine. He knew how to make people trust him in a first meeting. But the pandemic in 2020 hit the energy sector head on. Oil prices plunged into negative territory for the first time in history that April. Meridian, right, a young company without sufficient financial reserves, fell into a severe crisis. In March 2022, Brandon called me at 10 o'clock at night. It wasn't a routine call, but there was something in his voice I recognized immediately. The voice of someone trying to stay calm while panicking. "Dad," he said, "Meridian needs $340,000 within 30 days or we'll have to file for bankruptcy." I listened to him explain the situation for 20 minutes. Then I asked one question. "If I give you that money, do you think Meridian can make it through?" "I think so," Brandon said. "The market is recovering. If we get 3 more months, we can close 2 deals that are already in negotiation." 3 days later, I transferred $340,000, a large portion of the retirement savings I had built over 37 years, into Meridian Energy Solutions account. No loan documents, no conditions, just a father and his son. Meridian survived. The 2 contracts were signed, the company recovered, and 13 months later I stood in a server's uniform in the dressing room of the Petroleum Club Houston. I want to talk about those early years in Midland, Texas, because that was where I truly became an engineer. Not in terms of degrees or titles, but in understanding the layers beneath the ground in a way that purely theoretical engineers never do. My supervisor was Harold Whitaker, a man in his 50s when I met him, with 30 years in the oil fields and a reputation for being demanding but fair. In my first week, Harold took me out to a drilling rig at 3 in the morning. No explanation. Just, let's go. We stood beside the drill in the Texas night, under a sky full of stars, and he asked me, "What do you hear?" "I heard the drilling machine." I said that. "Listen again," Harold said. I stood still and listened. After about a minute, I noticed a subtle change in the rhythm. Not the volume, but a pattern. Like an irregular repetition every 15 seconds or so. "What is that?" I asked. "That's the machine telling you about the formation below," Harold said. "If you know how to listen, you'll know before the sensors do. If you don't, you'll always be reacting after the fact." I learned how to listen during those 3 years in the Permian Basin. It wasn't a skill taught at Texas A&M, and later I realized it was the difference between a good engineer and a great one. That skill, not noise but listening, was what I used on Friday night at the Petroleum Club Houston. Sandra Louise Mitchell, née Parker, was the woman I met at a dinner in Austin in 1990 when I was a mid-level project engineer at ExxonMobil, and she was teaching English literature at the University of Texas. We were different in the way people like to call opposites, but in reality, we complemented each other. I worked with numbers, machinery, and geology. She worked with language, meaning, and how people tell stories about themselves. What Sandra taught me wasn't literature, it was how to read people. Arthur, she used to say, you're better at reading rocks than reading people. Rocks don't lie, people do. She was right, and that was something I lacked for many years. The ability to read people's motives, not just their technical competence. Sandra passed away in 2015, a 6 months from diagnosis to pancreatic cancer, taking her. Too fast for anyone to truly prepare, even though you know no one ever can. In the 2 years after she died, I withdrew. Not in a way that stopped me from functioning. I continued consulting, maintained my relationship with Vanguard, did what needed to be done. But I stopped paying attention to the world around me the way I used to. That is why I didn't recognize soon enough what Brandon was becoming. Looking back, I see the signs early on, but at the time I was lost in my grief and not attentive enough. During the 2 hours I moved around the ballroom with a tray of canapes, I observed things others didn't notice because they were focused on conversation and performance. Brandon moved through the room in a pattern I recognized after about 30 minutes. He spent the most time with whoever held the most power in any group. And when that hierarchy shifted, when someone more important entered, he adjusted almost immediately, more visibly than most people would. That isn't inherently wrong. It's how many people network in business, but it reveals priorities. Brandon was building relationships with positions and power, not with people. His wife, Jennifer, 35, whom he married in 2018, stood near the entrance, maintaining a smile in the way of someone who is deeply tired, but not allowed to show it. And I didn't speak to her that night, but I observed enough to know she was in a situation she wasn't comfortable in. And I noticed a small detail whose meaning only became clear later. At the Vanguard table, Daniel Park checked his phone twice while Michael Chen was speaking with someone from Meridian. It was the gesture of someone waiting for something more important than the present conversation. Only after I texted Michael and met him in the restroom did I understand what Daniel Park was waiting for. Confirmation from Vanguard's legal department regarding certain contract clauses Meridian had requested to change at the last minute. Those changes, which I later reviewed in the contract, included a buyback clause I had previously mentioned. Brandon had added that clause within 48 hours of the event, without informing Vanguard in advance. That was why Daniel Park was waiting. I want to say more about Vanguard Gulf Partners, because it is not just a name in this story. It represents 20 years of my life and the work of 4 close partners. In 2003, when we founded Vanguard, the Gulf of Mexico oil industry was at a critical transition. Deepwater drilling technology was advancing rapidly, but most small and mid-sized operators lack the strategic capability to fully leverage it. The idea behind Vanguard was simple but valuable. Bring high-level technical knowledge and market experience, the kind only gained after 20 or 30 years in the field, to smaller companies that needed strategic guidance but couldn't afford major consulting firms in Houston, Dallas, or London. Now, Michael Chen, a Taiwanese American who had worked at Shell and BP before joining a Houston energy startup, was the ideal public face of Vanguard. He had presentation and persuasion skills I didn't, and I had the technical depth and industry network he needed. The other 3, Jim Harrison, a former Chevron geophysicist, Maria Santos, a project finance specialist, and David Okafor, an ocean engineer from Nigeria who had studied and worked in the US for 30 years. Each brought a distinct area of expertise to Vanguard. Over 20 years, Vanguard advised on more than 100 projects, from small exploration efforts in Louisiana to major deep-water joint ventures in the Gulf of Mexico. We were never the largest or most famous consulting firm in Texas, but we were the firm people in the industry trusted. Yes, trust. That was what Michael Chen always said was Vanguard's core value. Not intelligence, not experience, not network. Just this. When Vanguard says something, people know it's true. That's why I couldn't allow Vanguard to sign a contract with Meridian under the conditions Brandon had quietly inserted. I walked around the ballroom with a tray of canapes for the first 2 hours of the evening, and no one looked me in the face. That wasn't surprising. Servers often become invisible to guests in a way no one intends but still happens. People look at the tray to take food, not at the person holding it. That gave me something no one else in the room had: the ability to observe without being observed. I stayed near the Vanguard Gulf Partners table long enough to catch fragments of conversation. Michael Chen was speaking with two others. I recognized Daniel Park, Vanguard's commercial attorney, and Rebecca Yates, their chief financial officer. The Meridian contract is small, Michael said calmly, in the tone of someone used to much larger numbers. But it's a new market. If we get into Houston, we get into Texas. They say the younger Mitchell has strong connections, Daniel Park said, but I haven't seen a track record that impressive. We're signing for geographic strategy, not because Meridian is exceptional, Michael said. $4 million over 2 years. We'll see. I set my tray down on a nearby service table and poured drinks no one had asked for, staying close enough to hear more. Does the chairman know about this contract? Rebecca Yates asked, lowering her voice just enough to signal the question carried weight. Michael glanced around out of habit and shook his head. The silent partner isn't involved in day-to-day operations. A contract at this level is within executive authority. I stood still. There is only one silent partner in Vanguard Gulf Partners, and that is me. Over the next hour, I continued serving and listening. Not eavesdropping in a malicious sense, but listening with the attention of someone who had spent 37 years in this industry and knew when a conversation had layers beneath the surface. From scattered pieces, I assembled a clear enough picture. The contract Vanguard was preparing to sign with Meridian was not just a standard consulting agreement. Based on what Daniel Park mentioned elsewhere, it included a clause giving Vanguard the right of first refusal to acquire Meridian Energy Solutions within 2 years if certain growth targets were met. That clause wasn't unusual. Large firms often use it as a trial step before acquisition. But Brandon had never mentioned it to me. Now, the second thing I learned from a conversation between two Meridian representatives, Brandon expected that if Vanguard acquired Meridian, he would personally receive about $2 million for his equity. And the third, the one that made me stop mid-step with the tray in my hands. There was no clause in that contract addressing the $340,000 I had transferred into Meridian the previous March. No clause, no provision, no plan. If Vanguard acquired Meridian, Brandon would receive $2 million. I would receive nothing from my $340,000 investment. I stood in the corner of the room, watching my son at the center of the ballroom, laughing with partners. I felt something inside me harden in the way it only does when doubt disappears and truth becomes clear. "Not all right," I said quietly. I took out my phone, the kind of object no one notices when you're wearing a server's uniform, and sent a message to Michael Chen. "I need to see you now. Restroom, 35th floor. 2 minutes. Arthur Mitchell." Michael Chen read the message at 8:45 p.m. I know because I saw him glance at his phone from about 10 meters away, and I saw his expression shift. Not dramatically, just a subtle tightening around the eyes of someone recognizing something unexpected. He came to the restroom exactly 2 minutes later. When he walked in and saw me standing there in a black server's uniform with a white apron, he stopped completely. For 2 seconds, neither of us spoke. Arthur. His voice was calm but carried an unspoken question. Michael, I said, I know you're wondering why I'm dressed like this. I'll explain later. For now, I need to tell you this. I am Vanguard's silent partner. You know that. And I need you not to sign the contract tonight. Michael looked at me for a few seconds. Why? That contract has an ethical issue, I said. Meridian's CEO is positioning himself to profit personally from the buyout clause, while an outstanding financial obligation to a private investor remains unresolved. That investor is me. A pause. That's your son, Michael said. Not a question. Yes. Arthur, I need more clarity before... I understand, I said. You'll have full information, but tonight I need you to hold. Michael Chen studied me for 10 seconds. The look of a man who had known me for 20 years and knew that when I spoke in that tone, it mattered. All right, he said, I'll delay. The signing ceremony was scheduled for 9 o'clock. The peak of the evening, the moment Brandon had prepared as a performance for the guests to witness. At 8:55 p.m., I went into the restroom one last time, took off the white apron, folded it, and placed it in the linen bin. The black shirt remained, but without the apron, it looked like a simple dress shirt, not a server's uniform. I looked in the mirror. A 65-year-old man, gray hair, engineer's hands. No suit, no tie. Just a black shirt and the truth. All right, I said to the man in the mirror. At exactly 9 o'clock, Brandon stepped onto the podium at the front of the ballroom, microphone in hand, wearing the broad smile of someone about to have the best moment of his night. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, this is the moment when Meridian Energy Solutions and Vanguard Gulf Partners will write a new chapter in the history of both companies. I walked across the room, not hurried, not loud. I said nothing until I reached the steps leading up to the podium. Brandon, I said, loud enough for those nearby to hear, but not loud enough to cause a scene. My son looked down and his expression shifted, through several emotions so quickly others might not have noticed. I did, because I am his father. Dad, I need to say a few things before the parties proceed with the signing, I said, my voice calm and clear in the way of someone who has stood in more meeting rooms than he can count. I stepped onto the podium, not pushing Brandon aside, but standing next to him, and turned to face the guests. My name is Arthur Mitchell. I am a retired petroleum engineer after 37 years in the industry, and I am the silent founding shareholder of Vanguard Gulf Partners. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that happens when 60 people stop speaking at once. I looked toward the Vanguard table. Michael Chen was watching me with an unreadable expression, but I knew he was paying close attention. As a founding shareholder of Vanguard Gulf Partners, I must inform all parties present that the proposed consulting agreement between Vanguard and Meridian Energy Solutions must be suspended and reviewed before any signing takes place. The specific reasons will be presented in a formal meeting on the next business day. I turned to Brandon. His face had gone pale. Thank you for your attention, I said. Then I stepped down from the podium, walked across the room, and left the Petroleum Club Houston. The Permian Basin is a flat, dry land in West Texas. Not beautiful in the way people usually think of beauty, but beautiful in its absolute honesty. Nothing is hidden there. Land is land, sky is sky, and beneath the ground lie billions of barrels of crude oil that you can only reach if you are smart enough and patient enough. My supervisor in my first year was Harold Briggs, a third-generation Texan, 70 years old when I met him. Gray-haired, with a voice rough like someone who had smoked for 40 years, though he hadn't. Harold had worked in oil since the 1950s and had seen enough people pass through his office to know who would last in the industry and who would leave. I mentioned the bronze medal in the title of this story, but haven't explained it yet. This is where I need to. In 1999, I joined the engineering team designing a recovery system for the Thunder Horse offshore field, the largest oil field in the Gulf of Mexico at the time, owned by BP, located at a depth of over 1,800 meters. It was the most complex engineering project I had ever worked on, because at that depth, pressure and temperature created challenges that many textbook theories no longer applied to in a straightforward way. Harold was not kind in the usual sense of the word. He didn't give praise, didn't offer encouragement, didn't say good job after every task. He was kind in another way. He treated me like an adult capable of learning and taking responsibility, not like a student who needed to be guided step by step. On Monday morning, April 17th, I sat at the head of the conference table at Vanguard Gulf Partners office in the Energy Corridor in Houston. The first time I had formally sat at that table in 20 years since choosing to remain anonymous. Present, Michael Chen, Daniel Park, Rebecca Yates, and me. I laid everything out. The $340,000 investment into Meridian the previous March, with no loan documentation, no repayment terms. The buyout clause in the proposed consulting agreement, under which Meridian's CEO, who had an outstanding financial obligation to me, stood to gain significant personal profit if Vanguard acquired the company. This is not a criminal legal issue, I told Vanguard's leadership. This is a matter of business ethics and conflict of interest. If Vanguard wants to continue working with Meridian, my conditions are: first, the $340,000 must be formally recognized as a loan with clear repayment terms before any agreement is signed. Second, the buyout clause must be removed from the current version. Third, Meridian's CEO must disclose this conflict of interest to all current investors. Michael Chen listened, looked at Daniel Park, then back at me. And if they don't agree? Then we walk away, I said. Vanguard doesn't need partners who fail to meet basic ethical standards. There are plenty of other opportunities in Texas. The meeting ended at 11. That afternoon, Daniel Park sent notice to Meridian Energy Solutions. The consulting agreement was suspended indefinitely pending compliance with the conditions. Brandon called me Monday evening. I was sitting on the porch of my house on Memorial Drive in Houston, a glass of cold water in hand, and I let the phone ring 4 times before answering. "Dad," he began. His voice carried several things at once: anger, confusion, and beneath both, something I wasn't ready to name yet. "Brandon," I said, "do you understand what you just did? You just sabotaged 2 years of my work. That contract? That contract has an undisclosed conflict of interest," I said, my voice no louder than usual. "You know that." Silence. "My $340,000, I continued, is my retirement money. I gave it to you not because I'm wealthy, but because you asked. And in the contract you were about to sign with Vanguard, there isn't a single word about repaying it. Can you explain that?" A longer silence. I thought you gave it." "You thought, or you wanted to think?" No answer. "Brandon," I said, "I'm not going to make this a legal fight. My conditions with Vanguard have been stated, and they will contact you. You can accept those terms and move forward, or you can refuse. That's your decision. And if I refuse?" "Then Vanguard walks," I said, "and I will withdraw any capital I have tied to anything connected to Meridian." My father has no equity in Meridian. $340,000 is equity, I said, whether you see it that way or not. In May 2023, I met with my attorney and finalized the legal documents. The $340,000 was formally recorded as a loan from Arthur J. Mitchell to Meridian Energy Solutions, maturing in 3 years with market rate interest. Meridian signed. Not because Brandon wanted to, but because his attorney explained that not signing would be worse. Vanguard Gulf Partners ultimately signed a consulting agreement with Meridian, a revised version under my conditions. No buyback clause, and Meridian's CEO must fully disclose any relevant conflicts of interest. I no longer bore any additional financial risk from Meridian. They had a contract with Vanguard. They had a business plan. They could swim on their own from here. And I took back my strength to do something else. In September 2023, I officially retired in the true sense of the word. Not retired from work. I remain a shareholder in Vanguard and occasionally provide technical consulting on a few small projects. Retired in the sense that I stopped and decided what I actually want to do with the rest of my life. The house on Memorial, the 3-bedroom home Sandra and I bought in 2006 when we were still together, the house Brandon grew up in, became the place where I began again in a new sense. Sandra, my wife, passed away in 2015. Pancreatic cancer, 6 months from diagnosis to her passing. That is something I do not write about because no words are sufficient to describe it, and it is not the center of this story. But Sandra is the reason I failed to notice the signs from Brandon in the years that followed. I was inside my grief and overlooked what I should have recognized sooner. In September 2023, I officially retired in the true sense of the word. Not retired from work, I remain a shareholder in Vanguard and occasionally provide technical consulting on a few small projects. Retired in the sense that I stopped and decided what I actually want to do with the rest of my life. The house on Memorial, the 3-bedroom home Sandra and I bought in 2006 when we were still together, the house Brandon grew up in, became the place where I began again in a new sense. Sandra, my wife, passed away in 2015. Pancreatic cancer, 6 months from diagnosis to her passing. That is something I do not write about because no words are sufficient to describe it, and it is not the center of this story. Yeah, but Sandra is the reason I failed to notice the signs from Brandon in the years that followed. I was inside my grief and overlooked what I should have recognized sooner. Epilogue. Status can be borrowed. Character must be built. I write these lines on a November morning, sitting on the porch of the Memorial House, drinking black coffee and looking out over the front yard where the Texas oaks are turning in Houston's rare autumn weather. Brandon and I are still in contact. Not as father and son as before. That damage is real and needs time to heal. But we talk. He called in July to say Meridian had signed 2 more contracts and the company is stable. I listened and congratulated him. That is enough for now. There are things I want to say, not as advice, but as truths I have learned. About money and family. When you give money to someone close, whether children, friends, or anyone, do it with clarity. Is it a gift or a loan? If it is a gift, give it and expect nothing. If it is a loan, I put it in writing, not because you don't trust them, but because clarity protects both sides from misunderstandings that can destroy relationships later. I did not do that, and I had to learn the lesson the hard way. About status and character. At that dinner, no one looked at me when I was carrying a tray of canapes. The same person, 10 minutes later, when I stepped onto the podium and introduced myself as a founding shareholder of Vanguard, had the full attention of the room. Nothing about me changed between those 2 moments, only the uniform and the context did. That says more about how people judge each other than about anyone's true value. Status can be borrowed. You can wear an expensive suit, stand in a luxury boardroom, read a business card with a long title, and people will treat you according to all those things. But character cannot be borrowed. Character is built over years through small decisions no one sees. Whether you keep your word, whether you treat those with less power fairly, whether you admit your mistakes. The humiliation Brandon caused me that night, making me wear a server's uniform in the very building where I had once worked and been respected, cannot change what I built over 37 years. He could change how others saw me for 2 hours. He could not change what is actually true. And that is something I think Brandon still does not fully understand, though I hope one day he will. Real power does not come from controlling how others see you. It comes from knowing who you are when no one is looking. I am 65 years old. I spent 37 years in the Texas oil and gas industry. I wore a server's uniform on April 14th and stepped onto a podium at 9 p.m. Both are true and both are part of my story. The coffee has gone cold. The November sun in Houston is warm and golden on the oaks. Today I have lunch with Michael Chen. We will discuss a small consulting project Vanguard wants me to join. Not because I need the money, but because I still have something to contribute. That is all anyone really needs. Arthur James Mitchell, Memorial, Houston, Texas. Our team spent 2 years designing and a year and a half implementing. We encountered many problems no one had anticipated. Materials did not withstand the combined pressure and temperature as theory predicted. Valve systems failed in ways not described in engineering manuals. And autonomous diving equipment malfunctioned at depths never tested before. Each time there was a problem, the team met. Each meeting, I observed who stayed silent when they didn't know the answer, and who spoke nonsense to cover their ignorance. The ones who stayed quiet and said plainly, "I don't know. Give me more time to find out." Those were the people I wanted on my team. The ones who talked a lot without substance, I noted their names and made sure they were not in the most critical meetings. In 2003, and when Thunder Horse entered testing operations, BP held a small ceremony for the project's key engineers. Not a large or public event, just a dinner in a conference room in Houston, and each person received a small bronze medal engraved with the project's startup date and the field's name. The small bronze medal, about 3 centimeters in diameter, as thick as a dollar coin, is something I have kept in my bedside drawer ever since. Not because it has material value, but because every time I hold it, I remember 3.5 years of late-night meetings, solutions found at 3 in the morning, and the feeling when the first system began pumping oil as designed. Brandon knows about that medal. When he was a child, he used to take it out and play with it, asking me what it was. I told him about Thunder Horse many times. And that night at the Petroleum Club Houston, I carried that medal in the pocket of my black server's shirt. Not because I had a specific plan, but because I tend to carry it when I need to remember something important. I want to say more about my encounter with Michael Chen in the Petroleum Club restroom that night, because it was not as simple as I first described. Michael and I have known each other for 20 years. In those 20 years, we've had every kind of conversation. Strategy discussions at 3 in the morning in Vanguard's office, heated arguments about the company's direction that sometimes ended with both of us walking out of the meeting room without either side backing down, and quiet conversations after a project failed, when we had to look back at the decisions that led us there. When Michael walked into the restroom and saw me in a server's uniform, there was a moment I saw on his face. Not surprise, but the quick recognition of someone who understands a situation without needing much explanation. "Arthur, what are you wearing?" he asked, his voice calm. "A temporary staff uniform," I said. "My son invited me here in that role." There was a pause. Then Michael said, "I understand." Those 2 words carried more than what was spoken. "About the contract," I said. "I'm not asking you to do this because I'm the father of the partner company's CEO. I'm asking because this is a matter of Vanguard's business ethics standards. If you disagree with my assessment after hearing the full information, I will respect the executive team's decision." Michael looked at me for about 10 seconds. 20 years, he said. "You've never used your position as a shareholder to interfere with operations. If you're doing it now, I believe there's a serious enough reason." "There is," I said. "All right." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Arthur, I'll hear everything in full on Monday, but tonight I'll delay. Not because you asked, but because our lawyers haven't confirmed the final revisions. and signing a contract that hasn't been fully reviewed is not something I do. That was the answer of a professional executive, not out of personal feeling, but because it was the right professional decision. After I stepped down from the podium and left the banquet hall, I stood waiting for the elevator in the hallway outside the Petroleum Club. Brandon came out about 30 seconds later. I could hear his footsteps on the marble floor from a distance. "Dad," he said when he reached me. His voice was controlled in the way of someone trying not to speak loudly in an elegant place, but wanting very much to. I looked at him, said nothing. "Do you know what you just did?" "You just—" "Brandon," I said, my voice low and clear. "I know exactly what I just did. The question is whether you know what you did." "What are you talking about?" $340,000, I said. "An undisclosed buyback clause and a server's uniform." The elevator arrived. I stepped in. Brandon stood at the doorway. You can't. "You'll hear from my attorney early next week," I said, as the elevator doors closed. There was something I didn't say to Brandon that night, and I didn't say it during the call on Monday either. Something I truly wanted to say but couldn't find the right moment for. I say it here because this is my story, and I have the right to speak what was left unsaid. I wasn't angry about the server's uniform. I wore it, walked around the banquet hall, observed, and gathered the most important information of the night. In terms of outcome, it wasn't humiliation. It was an opportunity. What truly hurt me wasn't the uniform. What truly hurt was what Brandon said before I stepped into the dressing room. "You should be grateful I'm giving you a job so you can feel useful." That sentence wasn't just arrogance or ingratitude. It revealed that Brandon believed something. That a person's value depends on what others give them, not on what they have built and who they are. That being useful is something granted by others, not something you carry within yourself. I don't know where he learned that. I don't think I taught him that. But I know that sentence was a sign of a problem much deeper than greed or ingratitude. And that is something I still don't know how to approach. Not with money or lawyers or contracts, but with a father and son, sitting down and having an honest conversation. I haven't managed to do that yet, but I think that is the next task. He used to say, "The ground doesn't care about your degree. It doesn't care where you graduated or what your grades were. The ground responds only to physics. You get the physics right, you get the oil, you get it wrong, you don't." There is something I haven't told about that Friday morning before the dinner. The morning before I went to the Petroleum Club and stepped into the dressing room and saw the black uniform waiting for me. What Harold Briggs gave me wasn't technical knowledge. I already had that from Texas A&M. He gave me what in English is called ground truth. Truth from the field, not from books, not from theory, but from direct experience with reality. The year I left Midland for Houston and was promoted to regional manager, Harold shook my hand and said something I still remember. "Arthur, you've learned enough to become an engineer. Now the next step is to learn enough not to forget how you learned it." I didn't fully understand that at the time. 30 years later, I know I do. He was talking about the intellectual humility, the ability to recognize that knowledge gained from real-world experience is as valuable as, and often more valuable than, theoretical knowledge, and never to let titles or status make you forget the true source of your understanding. From 1990 to 2002, I spent a significant amount of time working on offshore platforms. Not constantly, but enough to understand what that kind of work demands. Offshore rigs in the Gulf of Mexico are a world of their own. Hundreds of kilometers from land, working 12-hour shifts for 14 consecutive days, no phones. In the 1990s, there was no mobile signal out there. No news from family except through scheduled radio communication. That creates a particular kind of community on the rigs. You live and work with the same people for 2 weeks with no alternative. And that forces you to learn how to resolve conflicts, how to trust others with your safety, and how to work effectively with people you may not necessarily like but must cooperate with. One of the things I learned on the rigs is this: in a dangerous environment, there's no room for ego. When a pressure valve jams at 2 in the morning and you need the person next to you to fix it before the situation becomes dangerous, you don't have time to think about titles or who's the boss or who needs to prove themselves. You just need that person to do their job correctly. That, ego free collaboration under pressure, is something I carried back from the rigs and applied in many other situations, including that Friday dinner at the Petroleum Club, when I needed Michael Chen to trust me enough to follow my request without having time for a full explanation. I mentioned Jennifer, Brandon's wife, once earlier in the story. I want to say more about her because she is an important figure in the larger picture I'm describing. Jennifer Michelle Hardy. Mitchell is an intelligent woman and, based on what I've observed in the 6 years since she married Brandon, a fundamentally good person. She works in human resources for an oil and gas company in Houston. She cares for their 5-year-old daughter, Lily, with clear patience and love, and she treats me with polite respect every time we meet. But that Friday night, I saw Jennifer standing near the entrance and realized something I hadn't paid enough attention to before. She was uncomfortable, not in the way someone is tired after a long evening, but in the way of someone who is in a situation they did not choose and do not fully agree with. And after everything with the Vanguard contract was resolved, in the weeks that followed, Jennifer called me once. Not Brandon, but Jennifer. She said only one sentence. "Mr. Mitchell, I want you to know that I didn't know about Brandon's plan regarding your money." I believed her. Not because I wanted to, but because of how she said it. No long explanation, no self-justification, just a straightforward statement. The way someone speaks when they are telling the truth. "Thank you for telling me that, Jennifer," I said. "I know." She hung up. I don't know where her marriage with Brandon stands, and it's not my place to judge or interfere. But I think Jennifer is a better person than Brandon deserves in his life, and that is a thought I keep to myself. After the $340,000 loan was formally documented and Meridian agreed to my terms with Vanguard, I spent the summer of 2023 in a way I had never experienced in 37 years of working, slowly and without urgency. The house on Memorial has a large backyard where Sandra used to grow flowers. After she passed, I stopped tending the garden and it gradually became overgrown. That summer, I began clearing it and planting again. Not because I have a natural inclination for gardening, but because I needed something to do with my hands, while my mind worked through other things. Gardening, I discovered, has something in common with petroleum engineering. Both require you to work with natural systems according to their own rules, not your will. You cannot force a plant to grow faster than its nature allows, and you cannot force the soil to produce beyond its capacity. You can only create the best conditions and then wait. That is also what I learned about my relationship with Brandon. I can create conditions. I can be clear about values and boundaries. I can be patient when he is ready to have an honest conversation. I can leave the door open until and if he chooses to walk through it. But I cannot force him to mature faster than his nature allows. That is the hardest part. Not the legal or financial actions, but the patience of not controlling the outcome. There is something I haven't mentioned about the moment I stood on the podium that night. Not something dramatic or eventful, just a small thought I remembered afterward. When I stepped onto the podium and looked out over the room, 60 people in suits and evening gowns, glasses in hand, candlelight and the glow of the Petroleum Club. I thought of Harold Briggs standing on a rig floor at 3 in the morning in Midland in 1985, asking me, "What do you hear? What did I hear in that room at 9 p.m. that Friday?" I heard the sudden silence of 60 people when someone no one had noticed for the past 2 hours stepped onto the stage. And in that silence, I heard the unspoken question, "Who is this man?" The answer I gave, "I am Arthur James Mitchell." in a retired petroleum engineer and an anonymous founding shareholder of Vanguard Gulf Partners, was not something I had prepared. I said it in the most natural way, as if it was simply what needed to be said in that moment. There was no sense of satisfaction or victory when I said it, only the feeling that something right had been done at the right time. The bronze medal in my shirt pocket was warm from my body heat. The small metal piece from 2003 when I stood on the operations floor of Thunder Horse for the first time and saw the system we designed begin pumping oil. Two moments 20 years apart in the same person. Both true. There is one person in this story I haven't said enough about. Lily Mitchell, 5 years old, the daughter of Brandon and Jennifer. Lily is a brown-haired, brown-eyed child like Brandon was when he was young, but she has Sandra's smile. Wide and natural, the kind of smile that doesn't need to be calculated beforehand. She calls me Opa, not grandpa or granddad or any English variation, but Opa in the German way, though no one taught her that. She chose it herself, and I never asked why. In the months after the dinner, while the relationship between Brandon and me remained in a controlled tension, Jennifer continued to bring Lily to visit me on Saturday afternoons. Not every week, 2 or 3 times a month. I didn't ask why she did that, and she didn't explain. Lily and I would sit on the porch and look out at the yard while I told her about the places I had worked. Not technical details, but stories about places and people. I told her about the Gulf of Mexico at sunrise from an offshore rig, about the cold winters in Kansas during a pipeline project, about the smell of Louisiana-style coffee a worker on a rig near Baton Rouge used to bring. Lily listened and asked the kinds of questions children ask. Not practical questions, but questions about what surprises them. Opa, are the fish under the rig scared of the machines? Opa, does the ground know when people are digging into it? I don't have precise answers to those questions, but I like them. They remind me that the world contains more things to wonder about than to explain. That is why I keep my Saturdays. Not because of Brandon, not because of Jennifer, because of Lily and her questions about fish beneath the rigs. Brandon called me on Wednesday to invite me to the party. Not an invitation in the sense of asking whether I wanted to come, but in the sense of informing me that I would come and help serve, because they needed extra staff. You're used to standing for long periods, you still walk every morning. It's not hard, just carrying plates. I listened and said nothing for about 5 seconds. Then I said, "All right." Brandon was surprised by the lack of resistance. "So you agree?" "I agree," I said. After hanging up, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and thought for about 20 minutes. Not about whether I should refuse, I had decided the moment I heard the request, but about why I agreed. Yes, the real reason was this. I wanted to see with my own eyes what Brandon was doing with his company. Not from the perspective of an investor or a father, but from the perspective of an invisible person, someone no one notices in the room. That is the kind of information you cannot get from financial reports or monthly phone calls. Harold Briggs once taught me, if you want to understand a system, don't stand where the system expects you to stand. Stand where it does not expect you to be. Standing on the stairway looking down at a rig gives you one perspective. Standing on the rig floor while the machinery is running gives you another, real and entirely different. The server's uniform was my rig floor that night. 37 years in the Texas oil industry taught me more about people than about oil. The Texas oil industry, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, was an industry with both enormous potential for wealth and the capacity for complete collapse, sometimes within the same year. Oil prices rose and fell based on factors that even the best engineers in the world could not fully predict. Fields believed to hold large reserves sometimes produced less than expected. Fields considered uneconomical sometimes produced more than anyone imagined. In that uncertainty, The people who lasted learned two things. First, never bet more than you can afford to lose. Second, build a reputation before you build wealth. Because wealth in this industry comes and goes, but reputation follows you for life. Now, Brandon grew up seeing the visible side of success in this industry: the large homes in Memorial and Tanglewood, the expensive cars, the dinners at downtown restaurants. He did not see enough of what lay underneath: 3 a.m. nights on drilling rigs, the right decisions no one ever recorded because they prevented problems instead of solving ones that had already occurred, relationships built over years rather than in a single evening of networking. What I believed and still believe is this: in any industry, your best tool is a reputation for reliability, not a reputation for success. Success comes and goes, but a reputation that when you say something, it is true. And when you commit to something, you follow through. That is why I could not allow Vanguard to sign a contract under the conditions Brandon had inserted. Not because it was about me and my money, but because Vanguard carries my name in terms of credibility. And that credibility is not something I can allow to be compromised by an unethical decision. The autumn of 2023 in Houston was the first in many years that I spent my mornings truly at ease. Not because I had nothing to do, but because I finally had the time to do what I actually wanted. I read more. Not technical reports or market analyses, but books. Texas has a rich literary tradition that people in technical fields like mine often overlook. I began rereading books by Larry McMurtry, a Texan, a Nobel laureate, who wrote about land, people, and the way Texas changes across generations. There was something I thought about often that autumn. My generation, those who built the Texas oil industry in the 1980s and 1990s, created a significant amount of material wealth. But what did we do to pass on not just that wealth, but what created it? The mindset, the values, the way of thinking about work and business ethics. The answer, and when I looked honestly at my own case, was not enough. I passed on industry knowledge to Brandon. I told him plenty of stories about rigs, geological formations, and major projects. But I did not pay enough attention to passing on what lay beneath that knowledge. Why those things matter. Why ethics in business are not something decorative, but something foundational. That is what I am still learning how to do. Not how to pass it on to Brandon because he is 38 and must learn many things in his own way, but how to pass it on to Lily, who is still at a stage where what she hears and sees from adults can shape how she views the world. That is why I do not refuse those Saturday afternoons when Jennifer brings Lily over. Not because I want to influence or compete with Brandon for Lily's affection, but because a child who asks, Opa, does the ground know when people are digging into it? Is a child learning how to question the world, and I want to be the one who shows her that such questions are worth asking.